I'm just overwhelmed with just the feeling I mean, I don't even know what to call it. I've been walking around the room, and I'm just touched. I wanted to take you back a little bit, and I apologize for any flashbacks to 2020. The world closed down. You remember? The schools closed. The churches closed. We were told to stay in our homes. People were every single fundamental right that we hold dear, in the name of public health authorities and our elected leaders said, we have to stop. You have to stop doing all the things that we normally would want to do. And the problem was that there never was any real scientific evidence that that was the right response to a respiratory virus pandemic, something that spread so easily. And what you had instead was fear, even among the educated class, even among scientists, many of them knew that it was the wrong response, and they stayed silent. So the Great Barrington Declaration, I co-wrote with Sunetra Gupta of Oxford University and Martin Kulldorff of Harvard University, and of Harvard University. We wrote it in October 2020, but it was really a restatement of the old pandemic plan, something that had worked for a century of respiratory virus pandemics. The plan was, don't lock down. Authoritarianism is not the solution to a pandemic. Authoritarianism is not the solution to a pandemic. Don't harm children by closing schools. Don't harm the poor. A UN report in April of 2020 had estimated that 100 million people would starve as a consequence of the economic dislocations caused by the lockdowns. Don't harm the poor, don't harm the vulnerable, don't harm the working class. Instead, pay attention to the data. The data showed that children were at incredibly low risk of dying or hospitalization from COVID infection, and while there was some risk to older people, especially older people with multiple comorbidities, children had very low risk. So pay attention to the data, protect vulnerable older people as best you can, but don't disrupt the lives of children. Okay, so enough flashback. I hope I haven't given you too much trauma or PTSD. I still have some from that. In October of 2020, when we wrote this declaration, Martin, and Sunetra, I'll tell you, it's the least original thing I ever wrote. It's the least original thing I ever worked on. It was just a restating the old pandemic plan. The reason we wrote it was to tell the world that there was no scientific consensus in favor of the lockdowns. I hate doing this because I don't think that you should have authority just because of where you teach. But you have Stanford, Harvard, Oxford professors saying the science doesn't support what everyone is saying, what you hear is saying. But in fact, the science points the other way. And the goal was to tell people that you were being lied to. And we succeeded in part. The days after we wrote it, tens of thousands of scientists signed on, doctors, epidemiologists, almost 1 million people signed it. Anyone in the room sign it? You guys can still sign it, by the way. Just go to the site. The declaration essentially told the world that you didn't need to follow the lockdown policies that actually plagued many countries, and certainly blue states around this country for a year after we wrote it. Schools stayed closed. My children, I live in California, didn't get to go to school really fully in person for another year and a half, for a total year and a half. And so we wrote this thinking that we would start a debate. Instead, what happened is that literally 4 days after we wrote it, the head of the National Institute of Health, a man named Francis Collins, a man I've long admired, wrote an email to Tony Fauci calling me, Martin, and Sunetra fringe epidemiologists. And then he called for a devastating takedown of the premises of the declaration. I learned about this in a Freedom of Information Act request a year later. What followed next was hit pieces about me, death threats, just sort of vicious attacks, the opposite of what a leader of a scientific institution do. Rather than encouraging a debate over a hot scientific topic where there's dispute, instead what you had was the mechanisms of a devastating takedown aimed at keeping people in the illusion that there was a consensus in favor of the lockdowns. It was a lie, right? There never was a consensus. Later, the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's office approached me and asked if I'd be interested in participating in a lawsuit against the Biden administration. They were alleging that the Biden administration had censored me and people like me. And in fact, in the discovery of the lawsuit, what we found was that was actually true. The Biden administration had set up something which a federal justice, as Jonathan Turley told you earlier, called a ministry of truth. A ministry of truth. Have you ever posted something on Facebook or Twitter and then you got a little warning label on it, or it was actually taken down? Anyone ever have that? That was almost certainly the result of a federal official leaning on a social media company, telling them who and what to censor. They may not have targeted you specifically, they just may have targeted the kinds of ideas you're sharing. And the social media companies complied because they were afraid of being regulated out of existence. One of the federal judges that reviewed our case, they made an analogy to Al Capone, where the Chicago gangster would go to Chicago businesses and say, boy, that's a nice business you have there. It would be terrible if something were to happen to it. That's our federal government, right? Al Capone. The problem then is that it was the policy of the United States of America, the policy of the federal government to suppress and silence people online that disagreed with their policies, even if what was posted was true. And so just to give you some sense of the kinds of ideas that they censored ideas like, if you have had COVID and recovered, you have some immunity. Really radical ideas. That children are harmed by the lockdowns, by school closures. Another radical idea, sending kids to school, I guess, is now a conservative value. If you had the vaccine, it only lasted, the protection against infection only lasted for a short period of time, and that if you had the vaccine, you could still get and spread COVID. That there are actually vaccine-injured people, right? So the Biden, it's really funny because the Biden administration censored, this is not the funny part, the Biden administration censored people who were sharing stories about honest vaccine injuries online because they thought it would mislead the American people into thinking that there could be vaccine injuries when there actually were. In fact, and this is the funny part, the Biden administration, when the Johnson & Johnson vaccine got paused in April of 2021, they posted it on their Facebook page. They had pushed Facebook to suppress what they called anti-vax messages. The White House Facebook page was tagged as an anti-vax group. They fell into the trap of their own censorship when they accurately reported that the CDC had recommended against had paused the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. The censorship complex used universities. They used my university, Stanford University, where I've been for almost 40 years, as essentially a way to launder their censorship activities. In the name of doing research, they engaged people at Stanford, the Stanford Internet Observatory, they called it, an Orwellian name if I've ever heard one, where the idea was that we will pay you to find themes that the government says is misinformation. Then Stanford would go to Twitter or whatever and say, these are the people you should censor. These are the ideas you should censor. So the censorship complex, as Jonathan Turley mentioned earlier today, is vast and it still exists. The Supreme Court case, the case, this Missouri versus Biden case that I mentioned earlier, it eventually went to the Supreme Court, and we got a hearing in the Supreme Court, which is a unique experience for me. I was a Stanford. If 7 people had heard of my papers, I was really happy back in 2020. To be in front of the Supreme Court was really a unique thing. The Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision this June, decided that me and my fellow plaintiffs did not have standing to sue. We lost in the Supreme Court in a critical free speech case where 3 of the conservative justices essentially decided that even though there was tremendous evidence that the government suppressed the kinds of ideas that I was expressing, the ideas I've just told you here, that me and my fellow plaintiffs did not have standing to sue. The case it was on over a preliminary injunction that ordered the Biden administration that they would need to stop contacting social media, pressuring them to censor people. The case now goes back down to the lower court, but a really dangerous thing, a precedent, I believe, has been set. A lot of the lawyers who I've talked with have told me, Jay, calm down, it's going to be fine. But I'll tell you, if I don't have standing to sue, that means you don't have standing to sue, right? Really, this was an attack on the American people. And the dissenting justices pointed this out. What they said was, the government can use the loophole of saying, look, we're not directly saying from some federal official to the social media company, censor Jay. What they can do is say, censor the idea that there's immunity after COVID recovery. And then if Jay says that, Jay gets censored. But there's no email saying censor Jay, and so nobody has standing to sue. In effect, the First Amendment in this country right now is a unenforceable dead letter. Now that can change. So the case is going to go back down to the Supreme Court. They'll rehear some of to the lower court, and they'll rehear some of this, and maybe there'll be some revision. But in the meantime, there is a bill sitting in Congress, sitting in front of the Senate, aiming to essentially tell the federal government, the deep state, if you will, that they're not allowed to go contact social media for the purpose of censorship. It turns out that we need a law to reinforce the First Amendment in this country. Anyways, I think that I don't mean to end at a negative thing. Actually, I have to say, coming here and hearing and talking to so many of you, I'm actually filled with hope for the future, especially seeing the robust exchange of ideas that we have here. I think people are really tired of being censored, being told that they can't say what they think, and especially by a government that got literally everything wrong during the pandemic. And so I am so delighted to be honored with this award. I'm so delighted to have the opportunity to meet with like-minded folks around the country who just want a chance to speak their mind, to live the American dream, which is to be in a country that says you can say whatever you want, especially to public health officials, especially if they want to keep you out of your schools, keep you out of your churches, that you still have a right to speak even in the middle of a pandemic. Thank you very much.